Hello and welcome to the AI Digest. My name is Joaquin Melara and I'm your host. With me today is Hazel Weakly, principal architect and famously known as the infrastructure witch of Hachyderm. Hazel, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Um, I'm just gonna address the elephant in the room. Where does this infamous nickname come from? Famous, however you want to say it. Where does it come from? I want to hear the story.
So that came from the Hachyderm Mastodon instance that I helped build and helped run. So that started off right around the time that Elon Musk had bought Twitter, and a lot of people were leaving Twitter in search of other social media platforms. One of which was Hachyderm, which was started by a good friend of mine, Chris Nova, around May of that year. And she had a couple hundred people on the server, and I was around person number 700 ish or so. And so I came in, really liked it, and got on the infrastructure team and planned to help them improve a bunch of things. What happened was during the month of November of 2022, we went from about 700 people to 35 to 45,000 people in 3 weeks. And in doing so, we accidentally turned Nova's basement into one of the largest Mastodon instances in the world. And it became critical production infrastructure, which nobody wants. Nobody likes to wake up to that. And so we launched a massive week-long incident in order to fix everything as it started breaking all around us. And we live streamed quite a bit of it. We worked on it. And during that process, that's where I got that nickname of being the infrastructure witch. Because I researched a bunch of things as we were learning and ended up accidentally writing the definitive guide to scaling and troubleshooting Mastodon on the internet. And I ended up, in the process of doing that, solving a lot of very tricky and unsolvable sort of problems and discovering a bunch of things and working with people. And of course, whenever we streamed and did things, you would always see other people doing commands and other people like writing to the terminal, and then me doing the weird, crazy sort of the weird nonsense in the computer and just ending things in a weird way. And everyone would go, that's some wizardry. And so the infrastructure was name stuck.
I appreciate that story. Thank you for sharing, and I think it's a testament to the unique role that you fulfill in the technical domain. Um, as we're gonna learn more throughout this interview, the crux of the topic that we're going to cover is how to overcome social problems of developing new technical initiatives. But really, we're going to be looking at socio-technical systems and how to enable elevations of those systems. Um, I think that's a great segue to talk about a little bit in your professional life, in your professional career. Um, what do you do as a principal architect now?
So what I do is I like to say that I solve unsolvable problems in that I help figure out what technical leadership at the company means. I help figure out what our infrastructure looks like now and in the future, and how to set everything up for success so that we are ready for the needs of tomorrow without sacrificing like the needs of today in order to get things done. And in doing that, sometimes that means solving really tricky technical problems. Sometimes that means bringing visibility into what's happening and what's going on. Sometimes that means doing a lot of really difficult alignment work, and sometimes that means changing the perception of people in the company and how they address certain problems, like de-risking change in production. Some people might have a strategy or a methodology that they like to do in order to feel confident releasing code or making releases to systems. And I want to take the very many and varied approaches at the company and figure out a way to harmonize them figure out a way to reconcile them and give people a coherent framework for things that result um, quantitatively in a more secure system and a more reliable system, but also importantly, things that qualitatively do that as well. It's one thing to build a system that can be updated safely, and it's another thing to give people personal confidence in their own code. And sometimes those require very different solutions. And so I reconcile that.
I'd love to ask this, and it's a bit of a tangent, but do you have a background in systems engineering or industrial engineering?
So I actually don't have a background in anything outside of like technology. So I did end up going to undergrad university for computer engineering first. And that ended up giving me some classes that I overlapped with civil and mechanical engineering. But I don't actually have a background in like systems engineering in terms of like on the physical world side.
I'm just perplexed and I'm trying to put the pieces together as to what environment, what nature nurture led to someone who has the confidence to look at the big picture and then
Mhm.
say, here's the little pieces of the puzzle we have to put together to make this picture work together. Um,
Yeah, so I can actually speak to that. Um, so one of the interesting things about my background that makes me able to do that is I'm really, really good at systems thinking, which doesn't necessarily come from a background in systems engineering, but instead it comes from a background in growing up in different types of disadvantaged communities and disadvantaged demographics and having to learn how to understand an unfamiliar system. And when that happens, then it ends up giving me that type of background where an unfamiliar system is something that I'm used to. Being able to make sense of it is something that I'm used to. And being able to see how all the pieces connect together is something that I've always had to learn how to do. And so it has become second nature to me over time.
and I'm sure that throughout your different car- career, organizational jobs, positions, whatever, you've had a chance to test your theories and sort of build assertions that are reflecting as truisms in your methodology, right? Like, okay, if I rattle the cage this way, it may backfire, but if I build a coalition first, I'll get
Mhm.
the wind behind my back to lead the charge.
Yeah. I've been able to do that, and that's a great way for learning. But another thing that is tricky there is I have a weirdly high track record of building systems and then having them work,
I
which
don't
is
think that.
that so like the back and forth of oh this didn't work and I need to like figure it out. A lot of people have to do that at every level, and for me that tends to only happen at the small. Like maybe at this one tiny little problem in the system is something that I need to work on and iterate and fix whatever. But at a certain size, when I start building systems beyond a certain size, they get to where they need to go. And I don't end up pushing out a very large change and then going, oh, I shouldn't have done that.
Well, I think as you mentioned earlier with your background around navigating unfamiliar systems, you have a different perspective as to what a technical architect, um, who really like I think this is my personal opinion, a technical architect has the responsibility to elevate a system through technical means, but they're also addressing social technical problems and how to marry them together. So you're looking at how do I reduce the absolute sheer explosion of psychological pressure that I can introduce by making this massive change, and I think that's what makes it a usable system. I think that's what makes it a
Mm,
successful system, you know?
yeah. And I really agree with that. One thing that I try and do with all of my systems is I try and look for ways to make, in a socio-technical system, make the technical side of things more human and the human side of things more technical. So what I mean by that is often in a socio-technical system, you have two different systems operating. You have how people perceive the system, and then you have how the system mechanically operates. And the system often mechanically operates in ways that are unfamiliar and not understandable to humans. So if you make the system more human, it has better adaptive capacity, it has better flexibility, it has better like resilience in all the ways that matter. And more importantly, as you improve that, the people become better and more able in understanding the system and being able to run it and become part of it. And then on the human side of things, in making it more technical, a lot of people sort of, particularly in tech, downgrade the importance of really understanding how you work together with people. And so they may have very informal collaboration mechanisms or very informal learning mechanisms or informal how do I teach people things? How do I like learn? How do I get better at my job? And it's fascinating that we will, on one hand, spend millions of dollars to make a system slightly more performant, slightly better, slightly like more technically superior in certain aspect. And people won't even spend $20 per developer teaching them how to do things better. But the developers cost 50 times what the system did. And like, really?
Hmm. Yeah. Um, yeah, there's some interesting things that I can pick out from what you're saying. Um, I think what you're addressing, if I were to give it a keyword, a term, technical accessibility. I think that's really rad, to make technical systems accessible, to
Hmm.
humans. And then, you're tackling culture and, investment in human resources and engineers and the people building the systems to further accelerate their learning, their feedback, loop, right? Because that's when you maximize learnings, they're more adaptive and have higher levels of confidence and productivity. So
Hmm.
it makes perfect sense that you tackle that double-sided coin in the way that you do.
Yeah. And when I think about how that looks in an organization, it's really, really interesting because, like, you have, as from an executive perspective, you have a very different picture than you do from like a director, and you have a very different perspective than you do as an engineering manager and as an individual contributor. And from like the executive level, you have the values of a company, you have like the mission of a company, you have the strategy, you have like how those values translate into engineering values or like tenets of engineering of like what are the trade-offs? How do I do that? And then you have the cultural aspect of the company. And that may not make a lot of difference, or you may not think it makes a lot of difference, but it actually makes an incredible difference. So, like, one concrete example I can think of is I worked at a company where culturally they had this approach to we want to do things right. They're a contracting company that specializes in formal verification. And it was we want to do things right, we want to do things from first principles. And first principles was such a strong engineering tenet and cultural aspect of the company. There's something really interesting happened. They became institutionally incapable of recognizing cross-cutting concerns in engineering, which meant that, like when I came in, and I recognized that they had this need for a internal like platform so that everyone could reuse CI. But what they were doing was they were reinventing a CI pipeline every single project. They were reinventing how to do everything every single project. How do I build things? How do I test it? Every project different. Every project reinvented. Nothing was reused. So their margin and their overhead never got smaller. And as the market started changing, started expecting that to be smaller, it they weren't able to keep up in certain ways because they didn't have that cross-cutting concern. So the thing that was fascinating was when I pointed out, people agreed, but they couldn't fix it because fixing it requires thinking in a different way than the culture has enforced and rewarded. And fixing it requires going against the grain. So what I did was I went to about 10 to 15 different projects and I got billable hours and billable time from each one of those projects. And then I took them, smashed them all together in a bucket of time, and then essentially went rogue inside the system. And I built them the platform that they needed and they wanted, but they couldn't have. And when I built it, I actually went overtime, so I used a couple of bits of flex hours, and I used some like other. I pulled from every nook and cranny to make it happen, and deployed it, and then left. And then, like, not only that, actually, I deployed it on an afternoon on a Friday, and then left for 4 months for parental leave. No testing, just bye. And then they had one issue, and they called me, and then that was it. And when I came back, I submitted my 2 weeks notice, which I hadn't planned to do that, but it ended up happening. So the Monday I came back, after 4 months, I submitted a 2 weeks notice. And that was several years ago. So I had an opportunity to talk with them, and I talked with one of the engineers and said, "So, how much do you hate me? You know, how broken is this thing? Like, do you still use it? Was it a waste of time? Did I ruin things for you?" Um, and not only is it great, they've had some difficulties with it, but it's pretty much worked flawlessly. It's addressed a lot of their needs, and one thing that was interesting was almost every single project at the company, past, present, and future, now uses it. Because they needed it, but they couldn't build it culturally.
Bottom line, you fucking rock. Pardon my French. Let me talk upon that perspective that you weave, because I think you put a very interesting piece of information there. There are archetypes to different organizations, and they prioritize or value different things based on the value system of the leadership of the executive team. I can only imagine that that sort of organization was spun up from a leadership that was heavily technical, and maybe they
Mm-hmm.
prematurely optimized, not think about how to make it cost effective or profitable to run. Not about building SOPs on how to like reuse infrastructure, reuse processes, gather learnings, and then fortify those things to continuously reduce the amount of overhead spent. Um, that's a real big problem. People don't realize what they don't know is a huge overhead tax for their
Mm-hmm.
operation.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting because there is an overhead tax for that. But if you look at like a startup has several different phases in it. And during that phase, you can think of the phases and goings in sort of an order of like you're exploring, you're trying to find the problem. And exploring is you fuck around, you find out, right? Like you have no idea who your users are, or if you have them, you don't know how they'll react if you change something. You don't know anything. And then you have the expansion phase, where you found something, it works. Everyone's mad because your stuff is breaking because you're just so over capacity, you're overloaded. People want it now, people want it bigger. So you have to figure out how to scale it to the moon as fast as possible. And then once that settles down, the business makes a strategic choice to stop rapidly expanding the size of something and start refining it and start extracting value out of a known quantity. And if you focus on the infrastructure in the exploration phase, you're going to die because you're not going to sufficiently and efficiently explore. But if you don't focus on the right type of infrastructure enablement, you won't be able to efficiently explore. So it's about making exploration efficient, making exploration sustainable, and making it really, really easy to rapidly innovate in any direction. That's what you need in that phase. Most people are really bad at understanding that and building that infrastructure. So they end up just building whatever because they don't have time to do it right and they might throw it away later. So they do whatever and they don't enable it in a cross cutting way. But then the tech debt comes from when the exploration turns into expansion and you don't throw it away and rewrite it because you don't have time.
You just keep
But
building
you
on top
also,
of
you just have to scale it to the moon. And so you make a bunch of last minute, oh no, everything's dying. I'm just going to put some hats in here and I'm going to, oh fuck, I'm going to put some hats in here. I'm going to do like some terrible crimes. And okay, I got everything stable. The computers are back online. And then I'll fix it tomorrow. And then tomorrow, different problem. And then you fix that one. And then so you end up building this massive duct tape and glue solution.
You're just firefighting at that point.
Yeah.
Perpetual
Which is
firefighting.
fine. Yeah. And like to be clear, that's fine. And not only is it fine, it's actually desirable. Because if you're not solving those scaling problems fast enough, you're not scaling as fast as you can.
Mhm.
You need to be spending all of your time doing the firefighting because that's what expansion looks like. It's this constant firefighting. And if you're trying to build the big, perfect thing while firefighting, you don't know where the next fire is going to be. And trying to predict it is going to end up tanking a company. So at no point does investing in infrastructure look like doing it right until the extraction phase. If you think about how a company works, you're going to have those three life cycles over and over and over in different parts of the company. So you want to develop a core competency and ability to make each one of those phases easy and to make each one of those phases, to make transitioning between them easy and to enable them in the small and the large. But a lot of people, and this is where a lot of people mess up, they think, I want to enable these phases technically. I want to enable them with solutions that are technical, with architecture, with code practices, with patterns, with no. Like half the stuff in your CI pipeline could probably just be an email. Half the stuff in your like super over engineering of a problem could just be when this happens, we just know to do this. Like, there's nothing wrong with having a button that says fix the thing. And then you have a button to the left of it that says fix the thing you broke with the other thing. Like having a magic and a more magic button, that's fine. But people don't like that. Like engineers don't like that. They wanna build the
It's safe.
shiny technical thing.
They wanna be safe. They wanna armor themselves prematurely. I think
Yeah.
that's, what you're saying makes perfect sense. In an ideal world, we would all, explore in the initial stage and find the right recipe, the right scientific hypothesis, evaluate the negative assumptions, and just screen to get the gold. And then we can just hammer that out aggressively to get
Hmm.
aggressive expansion in the marketplace and grab the biggest market share and then
Yeah.
fortify and cut it costs. um, but as we outlined earlier on, and as you very much spoke about that particular use case, that particular organization, it depends on the adaptiveness and the business intelligence or acumen or the experience on how to navigate
Mm,
those shifts, those stages, right?
yeah. You want to understand how to enable each stage in all the different ways. So, like exploration, for example, people might say, "Oh, building any infrastructure in the exploration phase is not worthwhile." There's a solid argument for that. There's a really solid argument for that. If you want to choose between building infrastructure and like building it right and exploring, fuck it, explore. Explore. That is the correct solution. But there is infrastructure you can build to make exploring better. So you can build feature flags. You can build continuous delivery. You can eventually build like canary rollouts. You can build things that let you just take a user base and then have everyone just push their code constantly to the main branch with zero tests and if or like very, very minimal tests and just it's safe, it's fine, it's okay. You have all these things to like make that expression a toggle or make it a flip or make it super, super safe to do. And people don't implement that because they don't know about it. Or they might think it's a waste of time. Building like a super advanced Kubernetes cluster is a waste of time in the exploration phase. Sticking a couple feature flags in your code base is not. But
Mm,
where's the line?
mm. I think I've gotten lost in the sauce in the preamble of this conversation, but I want to address your area of expertise, and I think that that's going to give us a synthesis for further topics to jump off of. But your expertise is in infrastructure and systems reliability. You
Hmm.
specialize in observability, platform engineering, and pay special attention, as we've talked about so far, in understanding socio-technical systems to improve technical leadership efforts and developer experience. And that's a mouthful, right? That's addressing a whole organization. Um, do you want to talk a little bit about that again from the context of how you enter an organization, evaluate, audit, and then recommend how to move that forward, how to elevate?
Yeah. So I got into all of those things, and you might be thinking, where's the connecting thread? Like, where's the similarity? What makes these a coherent set of like things I like to do versus 20 random interests in trench code? The 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 joining thread between the observability and the developer experience, the infrastructure, and all of that is I like to enable organizations. I want to be a force multiplier. I want to make the entire company more effective, more performant, happier, healthier, and able to do what they want to do better and have that focus. And in every area, it's a different aspect and facet of enabling that goal. So when I come into a company for the first time, what I look for is I first look for information. I look from people. And I try and talk to as many people as I can. And I try and find out as many things as I can. I read all of Slack as much as I can. Like I will read back a whole year in Slack threads if I can, or in channels, and I'll take notes. I'll take notes on the code base. I'll talk to people and take notes with them. Um, like for example, I have a whole bunch of like notes for my personal work. And since I've been here, since which has been about 10 months now, I have written about 12,000 lines of Markdown in notes, which turns into like probably close to 30,000 words.
So about ten meaty blog posts of just condensed insight.
Hmm. Yeah. It might actually be more than 30,000 words. Like it's a lot. But that type of thing ends up being my superpower. It ends up being the thing that really, really makes it possible for me to do what I do as quickly as I do and get the context and sit down and go, is this a real problem? Is this a people problem? Is it a technical problem? And like connect those threads together. Because most companies have a really, really bad ability, or not bad ability, an underdeveloped ability to understand themselves. Introspection is a huge weakness of a ton of like technically focused companies. And so I like to come in and do that introspection and try and make it visible so that I can identify problems that are high impact and addressable, and then start working on the people problems to enable the other problems to be solved.
But you win the small battles and you build your you build some sort of credibility and trust before you go and tackle the more pressing top down problems, the cultural problems, right?
Hmm. Yeah. It's like one, for example, one thing that I see a lot of people do when they come in as infrastructure, when they come in as like developer tooling or something, a really common thing for people to do is they come in, they look at the tech stack, they look at the code bases or something, and they go, "Oh, you're using a really slow linter, or you're using a really slow formatting tool, or you're using a really slow this or that." And if you just use this other one, it's so much faster, and you're like, speed, like your cycle time's gonna go down. All these other things are gonna be great. It's gonna be whatever. And then they just implement a pull request. And so their first pull request is changing out a tool in developer's workflow, and it modifies every single file in the code base. It changes the formatting and does everything, and it cuts off a minute in CI. And everyone hates you for life because you come in and people see you just like coming in with no context, no trust built up, and you change out something in someone's personal workflow, which people already don't like that. It's already, why would I change a workflow? It's like changing your daily routine.
It's intrusive.
Hmm. It's intrusive. And that type of intrusion is often reserved for like your spouse or your therapist. Like, really, imagine if I came in to like, if I just came into your house and I said, I've observed how you get ready in the morning. You brush your teeth before eating breakfast. Like, that is a waste of time. I'm going to make it so that you eat breakfast first and then brush your teeth.
Well, I'd kindly ask you to leave.
Right. Like, I would not be your friend. You would not like me. You would not want to be around me. It does not matter how right I am. It does not matter how correct I am or how much better your life is. Like, no, I didn't solve a problem you cared about. And I made you feel like I just came in and like dictated something silly to you and just like tried to solve a problem for you that you didn't even want me to solve.
Or that I didn't
And
recognize to be a problem. I mean,
right,
unless you establish some sort of context and credibility and trust, anything that you say
yeah,
that isn't aligned with my interests is gonna be seen as like, "Okay, you're just bullying your way here, and you're looking
mhm,
to influence me in ways I don't wanna be influenced. This isn't even a problem for
yeah,
me."
yeah. And one of the hardest things for that, like problem identifying specifically, like you really pointed out, one of those really hard things for people is problems, like the definition of a problem, the identity of a problem is very context dependent. It's only a problem if you say it's a problem. Like, what's the definition of a problem? I point at something and I say that's a problem. Until I point at it and say that's a problem, it's not a problem. So, like, for example, my director came in and saw some things and said, we don't have on call for our infrastructure in a way that's like actually on call. We should fix that. And I said, absolutely not. The reason I said that was because nobody cares. They should care. But if you have a team that's overloaded, if you have a team that's overworked, adding on call for a broken system is like not useful. It's going to burn the team out. And if it's not a problem to everyone else, if it's not something that's valuable or rewarded, you're going to come in and, quote, make everything worse by trying to make it better in a way that the system can't recognize yet. So we still don't have overnight on call. We don't have like a lot of monitoring. We don't have a lot of alerting. We don't have a lot of these things. What we have is people like me working on growing an awareness of the need for these types of things. And eventually, the infrastructure team will have a real on call. And eventually, the application teams will have less Terraform on call. But right now, we have that weird balance of like, it's not a problem. So don't make it one. Find things that people say are problems and like, look at that.
I appreciate that you are making sure that any context. First, context is the big driver here in this conversation,
Hmm.
and it's a way for us to share a perspective of the same reality, right? If we say this is the situation, red boots, jeans, striped shirt, this is the context of the situation. It gives us a mutual view as to what we're looking at rather than us pointing at different people. That's a really important part. Um, Damn, I lost my train of thought in making that dumb imagery.
The
Basically,
context, you're talking about context and how it's important.
yeah, no, I was gonna parlay that into something else, and then I just threw myself off with Where's Waldo imagery.
You know, you lost the context.
I lost the context of describing the context, as ironic as that is. I think you're just addressing a very interesting. Oh, there we go. The context of the context. Uh, you don't lose context of business continuity. That is your anchor, and you like if you're gonna scale a building, you're gonna fricking tie a
Hmm.
pole or a hook or whatever the safety term for the wire is, and you're gonna have a perimeter where you can work on. You could go rogue, but that is expending your social capital within an organization because then you act like a virus. You go over
Right.
people's heads and there's repercussions for that. But the way that you're saying that you tackle these problems is safe and progressive and educative and building a coalition and working with people through people with people, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And like, so for example, one of the problems, not one of the problems, for example, one of the interesting things about working on turkey parts, a lot of developers hate tech debt. They'll call it tech debt, they'll point to it, they hate it, they don't like it. But my favorite definition of tech debt is work that is so unvalued by a company that you can get fired for working on it. That's my definition of tech debt. It is work that is so unvalued by a company, you will potentially get fired for addressing for addressing that. So the only way to solve tech debt is to not solve it. To turn it into something that is no longer tech debt.
That tech debt is an inefficiency in the system that is just handled by human hands that should be really elevate. It should be a sign to elevate the system so it takes care of itself, right?
Not always.
No?
Yeah. So sometimes you want humans in the system, and because humans are extremely good at something called adaptive capacity, which is if a system has an unexpected load or unexpected event or something like that, how can you respond and change the system a little bit on the fly to handle it? Humans are super good at adaptive capacity. So rather than trying to build a system that can anticipate everything, it's often better to build a system that can't, but has enough entry points for humans to adapt and make the system have that adaptive capacity. It's
Okay,
super fine.
I see the context of your statement. Yes.
Hmm.
I meant it more so like if there's something that doesn't necessarily require adaptive, it's just a routine rote type of performing a task that is uniquely to be driven by a machine, and it further frees up the humans to do more interesting, creative, adaptive work is where I was going. But it makes sense.
Yeah,
You're right. We shouldn't look for ways to completely eradicate humans from an organization or a technical system, but rather empower them within a role that maximizes their creative capabilities.
yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of hidden work that humans do, and trying to eliminate other classes of work can make the hidden work harder or even impossible. And so you have a lot of unintended consequences when you try and over optimize the humans out of something. So like dealing with tech debt can be really tricky, which is why I like to make it not tech debt.
Can we talk about how you frame that in a way inside of an organization or a situation?
Yeah. So often I say the word tech debt. What I start doing is I use the word tech debt in the context that other people do, and I talk with them about that. And if someone like has a resistance to the phrase tech debt, I like dig in with them and go deeper. But when I address tech debt, what I do is I take it and I refine the thing. So there's the problem. There's the understanding of the problem. There's like the context of the problem, and there's like how you identify it and what the solution would be, and then the timeline and so on. So one example of tech debt could be that we have like to use my company as an example. We have several different Kubernetes clusters, and all of them have been built using one of three different methods. They're not uniform. So ideally, we would fix that because that's some tech debt. It results in us being unable to uniformly upgrade all of our clusters and uniformly maintain them in a way that like works across everything. And let me add in a new one, difficult. On the other hand, if I just call that tech debt, we don't have time to work on it. We don't have time to improve it. But if I look at the problem and I, right?
A
But if I look at the
well-defined,
problem
yeah.
and
Uh,
I think about what is the definition of it and how can I get people aligned on it. So when I came in, I said all of our infrastructure is broken. I didn't say it like that. I came in, I understood the problem, and I like worked on understanding it, and I started pointing at things that are consequences, and that's my favorite strategy. Is to not talk about the problem, is to talk about the consequences. So talk about the things that are the implications, and people don't realize that. And then I don't even talk about the problem, and that gets people empathetic about it. Because if someone says, "Oh, every time I update this thing, it breaks a little bit," and I go, "Oh yeah, that's because we don't have a good way to manage the Kubernetes cluster in a certain way." Then someone else might have a different problem and say, "Oh, that's because we can't upgrade the Kubernetes cluster very well." And someone else might have a different problem, and I might go, "Oh, that's because the Kubernetes clusters here are out of date." Or that's because we don't have a uniform way to ensure that this cluster is the same as this one. And I just point out all the consequences and all the implications and all the like manifestations of the problem. And before long, everyone is going, my personal problems are solved by upgrading the Kubernetes cluster. And upgrading the Kubernetes cluster requires us to rebuild how we build Kubernetes clusters. And so we've taken the tech debt of our Kubernetes clusters. Some are manual, some are using one tool, some are using another. And we've turned it from a tech debt into this is a thing that is an enablement or disenablement of business goals. And everyone has a different business goal that they personally want achieved, and that can't be achieved until we solve this thing. So ideally, we can solve it. But importantly, we can now put it in the context of all the other business goals people have. Because one of the hardest parts of tech debt is you can't prioritize it. How important really is it to be able to upgrade all of our Kubernetes clusters? How do you compare that to, say, feature work? You don't. But if you go, oh, these different feature work items require this work to be done. And these different like security improvements or these different initiatives or these, we start tying them to like that problem, all of a sudden people might say, oh, my personal problem is like really high priority. And the organization might be bought in on that. And then that implicitly moves the Kubernetes rebuilding higher priority. I didn't make it a priority. I just tied it together. And tying it together and getting that context and having people identify the context in the problem and having them build that sense of empathy for it, that is what gets things to not be tucked up. And if you can't do that, then maybe it's fine to be tucked
yeah,
up.
maybe
Like there's
so.
nothing wrong with it.
Yeah. So first of all, you'd make a killer sales agent. You'd I don't know what you're doing in your line of work. You should go into consulting or sales. You'd make 5 times your salary because what you described elegantly is problem, agitation, solution. You see that there's a thing, you contextualize it. Initially, you say generic tech debt, generic sludge, a blob of gray matter. But then you contextualize it and you say, well, it's actually in your house. It's doing these things. It's clogging up your drains. Your water tastes yucky. You're introducing allergens to your kids. Maybe we should make a change. Maybe. I don't know. I'm just throwing that
Right.
out there.
Hmm.
Let's quantify the pain for that. And then is that inhibiting you from having the energy to go to the gym? Is that preventing you from having a delicious pasta?
Hmm.
Maybe we should change that gray sludge and clean the pipes and have just clean
Right.
water.
Yeah. And yeah, and that's a great analogy. And so, like, one example of that is that sometimes, like, when you identify the problem in more detail, it allows me to do my second favorite thing, which is to solve today's problem, identify like how I did the shortcut, how I would like to solve it properly, and what the limitations of the today's problem solving are going to be. And that like sets things up for people to start loving you. Because they're like, oh, we had this big thing and you said, oh, this can't be fixed until we rewrite everything, until we rewrite half the code base. However, this dirty little hack that I'm about to do is going to get the whole problem solved in 2 weeks. For now. And that like punts it down the road and like, but eventually we need to solve this thing. People like that conversation. They don't like being told that random things just are never going to happen until this massive other thing happens.
Mm,
So like back to Kubernetes clusters and de-risking production network. One problem we have is that we have one side of the organization has one approach to testing, one side has a different approach to testing. One side likes staged environments, the other side doesn't really have them. But we needed to actually start having a staging end-to-end collaboration between the two halves of the company because some business requirements changed and that became a thing. That's fine. But it meant that suddenly there was this friction of the data set that we had in one half of the company was not suitable for the other half of the company. And the only way to properly fix it would have been to build a new AWS account, a new Kubernetes cluster, a new, like, set everything up, create a new database, seed it with a bunch of data. In theory, if all of that's automated, I don't see that taking more than, say, like 2 hours. That would have taken us 4 months because nothing was automated for that. And so I came and I said, look, if you want this done before March, that's not happening. This was in November. If you want that done before March, if you want it done earlier than like 5, 6 months out, it can't really happen because all this other work needs to happen. And they said, that just doesn't work. Like that will cause us to miss clients. That will cause us to like lose these important things. And so what I said was, okay, I can work with that. So the solution I came up with was we already had replication from some of our production data into the stage environment. So what I did was I put a bunch of test data in production. Then I hit the test data from the production setup. And then as that got replicated down manually, you had a stage environment all of a sudden with data that could be used for staging on both sides. And that only took 2 weeks. And I said, hey, so this solves the problem for you indefinitely for 2 weeks. Is it ideal? No. Do I like it? No. Do I hate the problem a little bit? Yeah. Am I going to lose sleep at night over this? Kind of. However, we can do this in 2 weeks instead of 4 months. And you get so much trust from people when you're willing to say, like, this big thing has to happen, but we can work with the system. We can bend the system in order to make it work for you today. And it won't be ideal, but it will be a thing rather than not being a thing. And not only did you solve the problem for today, but and you got people's trust in you, but they now see like the limitations of that approach, and they have a huge motivation in solving this very tricky problem. So the next time a tricky problem comes with the same solution, cool, I can just keep adding to it until I build up all this organizational consensus that this thing has to happen. And that was one of the like one of many different approaches that I used to go from having no headcount in my organization to having a ton of headcount. We realized we needed to buy our way out and hire our way out of a huge amount of overwork. And that shift happened so quickly because I was able to point at all these different problems and say, here's the consequences.
So two things, maybe a third. You gained the fan today with me.
Mhm.
Second, I'm glad you're an agent of good because you do a whole lot of damage in this world. If you were unleashed on the dark side, uh, I don't want to even think about it. But damn, that's really smart. That's like you just gave a whole lot of that was a master class in how do you go into an organization and be an agent of good and a force multiplier. Like how to. You just gave the tutorial.
Mhm.
So very cool. Yeah, I mean, that pretty much covers everything that we were going to talk about in a very succinct way. You're going to talk about change management, pertaining to improvements, refactoring systems, getting buy-in, requirements gathering, setting stakeholder expectations, education, communicating vision. You just said everything, all of that in a very neatly, dynamically, like compressed way.
Mhm.
Very cool. Very cool. Maybe we
Yeah.
should walk through a few concrete scenarios instead of talking about gray sludge in your
Yeah.
pipe. Um, let's say you enter into a small organization versus if you were enter into a large multinational matrix organization and you're looking to add value and infiltrate for good, act as a change agent for good. Abstract problems, go ahead and pick whatever you want out of your arsenal. Um,
So I'm entering into a new like organization inside a larger
Startup.
company, and it's a
Let's start.
matrix. It's a matrix
Yeah,
style organization structure.
let's address what you would do in a startup to enhance and help them maximize their learnings from the exploration phase, and then
Mhm.
in the multinational organization where it's like siloed and matrix and everybody likes to stay in the little box. How would you break through the boxes to create, your little maze, your
Yeah.
interconnected network of supporters, to help them reduce the redundancies and have more efficient use of resources?
Mhm. Yeah. So for the small startup, the most important thing that I'm looking for there is I'm looking to avoid sunken cost. At any point in the startup, you could be pivoting, you could be adapting to change in the market, and you have very little inertia. So your adaptive capacity has to be almost, if not almost the size of, if not like largely dwarfing the size of the system itself. So you should be optimizing for having as much adaptive capacity as possible. A good example of that would be why people use cloud infrastructure so that you can size up and down rather than like buying servers and racking them. Another example of that could be how do I, sunken cost, how do I turn things off if they're not going to work? I don't want to have to refactor a code base to take something out. I want to be able to just leave it there because that's less effort, but I want to be able to turn it off later. So that lets me know that maybe I want feature flags and I want to design a development mechanism that is essentially append only. So one of the cool things about append only styles of working is database migrations are super easy. You never change any columns, you always add. You never change anything, you always add. You just keep adding forever. And then the schema becomes a mess eventually, but who gives a shit? Especially if you only use 10% of it. Um, so that's an interesting way to like do it. If you have a append only, if you have that sort of feature flag approach, If you keep everything in a very tight way, what you're looking to do is you're looking to take learning wise the shared collective knowledge and understanding of a company and make it as collective and shared as possible and make it as easy as possible to learn something. Like do an experiment, learn, grow with that knowledge, and then put it back into that circle of knowledge in the company and then have everyone learn it. So I would focus on infrastructure wise, like that very rapid deployment, very like canary ability to give something to a customer, give something to like just 5 customers or a product group or just any sort of subset. Employees only, like who cares? And make everything production. Just get that knowledge out there as fast as possible. Get that centralized in there and then make everything as visible as possible. So developers should know what the business intelligence is saying. They shouldn't just go, oh, that's in a Looker database somewhere, or that's in like, it's in some random Power BI bullshit, or screw it. Like that information should be available. And the computer, like the systems, should be putting data into Power BI. Like integrate that, mix it up, make everything together. And that's what I would really focus on for the small company. And then not trying to solidify the shape of anything to reduce that sunken cost. Like Kubernetes doesn't make sense for a lot of people because it's a very solid shape. And everything you build on Kubernetes requires you to have a certain shape to it. And it's very hard to have something that is not aware of Kubernetes while being ran on Kubernetes. And so consequently, you either build a huge amount of infrastructure, which you don't have time to do, in order to make all your applications not aware that they're running on Kubernetes, or you hardcode yourself to something and then the sunken cost becomes massive. Like, use Lambdas, use like literally anything. Use the smallest thing that gives you that adaptive capacity so that ideally you're just writing the code, you're writing the bare minimum of uniform packaging, and then you're just throwing it out to the wind. Solve the business problems and the people problems and the context and the learning stuff, and leave infrastructure and leave a lot of those other types of things that require a defined shape when you know the defined shape. There's parts of infrastructure that are context and parts of infrastructure that enable people and parts of it that do that defined shape thing. It's like feature flights are into defined shape. That's a great bit of infrastructure. Everyone should do it. Progressive delivery is not a defined shape. It's a great way to like get change out there. Saying I'm going to build my code in a certain way, and I'm going to hook up my instrumentation in a certain way, and I'm going to every time you have the phrase in a certain way, or every time you have, and it's on this platform, every time those implementation details leak in there,
You're
you're
making it
defining
harder
a
and
shape you don't
harder.
have. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're defining a shape that you don't have time to define in a small startup.
fair
One
enough.
thing, yeah, because like, so I think of it as sort of this cycle, right? When you want to implement something, when you want to implement change, you have culture as the very first step. And then you have process, and then technology, and then process, and then culture. So at the beginning, you start off with how do we do things? We have a culture of here's how we approach it. We don't have a solidified process, we have a culture. Like one example of the culture would be, Meta's move fast to break things. There's no process, there's no methodology, there's no like technology around that. It's just here's how we do things. If you have to pick between slowing down or speeding up, speed up. If you have to pick between learning something new in the process of breaking something or trying really hard, learn. Do it. Just put it out there. And that was their culture. Then eventually the process might come along and say, okay, how do I get people more aligned on the culture? And that might be, so we do continuous delivery. We do, and you're not specifying it. You're just going like, here's the process. Or here's how we learn about things. Here's how we put information in Slack in a way that's discoverable. Here's where our information lives. The process. is great because it codifies a lot of the culture, but it doesn't dictate the implementation. So just saying, we stick all of our learning, we stick all of our sales information, our sales funnels and everything in this one area. It's over there. That's your process. That's great. That's fantastic. Don't overthink it. I just start there. Then eventually that gets tricky to scale, and you start wanting to add some technology in there to like make it easier. That would be where continuous delivery might come in. That would be where having like Salesforce custom workflow things or like integrations between stuff so that you can write your notes and then that gets published over here and then that gets over here and then that gets tied to this thing and that gets linked up. Like all these sorts of tying things together, that's the technology enabling the process. When at some point the technology stops scaling or it becomes too complex, and so you end up building a process around operating with the technology. And at some point, you end up building a culture around how we evolve the process to operate the technology. And now you're right back where you started. And you keep doing that.
Hot dog. I mean, I'm just getting a lot of juice out of this conversation. What about a multinational, complex matrix environment?
So that one is really interesting. It's a fun challenge. Because if you think of learning, you have like so much context people can hold in their heads. And a lot of the organizational designs of a company are how do you take the market and take the company and you slice the context of the problem into a way that's manageable. And if you slice it in one way, like sort of, if you slice it vertically, you get the functional organization style. Like all the developers are here, all the ops people are here, the legal team's over here, the sales team is here. You have everything just do, 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 do. That's a vertical functional style. So it makes the context shaped a certain way and it scales a certain way. But it means that you end up siloed. If you have the other way of doing it, you have like this streamlined teams. And so you have like maybe one product. And that one product has a legal person, a developer team, you have the ops team, you have the everyone in the company is in that one section. And then maybe they don't even talk to other people. Maybe your developers have no idea what other developers do. Maybe your legal team has no idea what other legal people do. And that scales really well. That's like Amazon's style of working, where everything's very, very isolated. But one problem there would be the shape of the context is different, right? So what does that enable? What does that not enable? It enables no siloing, but massive amounts of duplication of work. So you have developers unable to handle cross-cutting concerns. You have teams that can't handle cross-cutting concerns. So everything becomes optimized on one thing, but the problem you run into is that that may make the overhead of addressing a market need untenable for the company. And so it can turn something that should be profitable into something that will be unprofitable. And that's a danger you run into. So the matrix style, a lot of people came out with the matrix organization style as a way of having the best of both worlds. And often you end up with the worst of both worlds. Because the benefits in theory of a matrix style are that you don't have the siloing and you have, in theory, you don't have the duplication of effort. In practice, you often get the duplication of effort anyway, and you have a confusing set of like gridlocks happening because you don't have really good boundaries and communications and collaboration and things like that. It requires a lot of organizational process complexity and maybe tooling and cross-linking in order to actually make a matrix style work well. And most people don't invest in that. So if I'm going to come into a matrix organization that's multinational and I'm going to try and improve things, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at how information propagates to the company and how decision making and how authority and how ownership and all these sort of different things flow through the system. I want to know where the loop is of identifying the market, figuring out a problem, assigning that problem to people, having them work on it, having them experiment, and like doing that feedback loop. I want to know where that happens and how that propagates to the rest of the organization. Often with the matrix style, you're going to end up with hotspots of gridlock, hotspots of learning, and then cold spots of like friction and cold spots of like siloing. And so I want to solve that and like make things flow in a way that doesn't deadlock information and deadlock action. So that would be where you see a lot of larger organizations, for example, adopting more advanced tooling to solve the code ownership problem or the service ownership problem or the problem of like alerting things. You start getting platform teams coming out. You start getting people using and building things on top of Kubernetes or on top of other things. You end up with something that looks functionally a lot like, say, Netflix or a lot like other things where you build small teams that solve that like cross section problem. And so if I'm going to come in and like focus on changing things, the cross linking becomes hugely important. The clarity around function, the clarity around like who does decision and how we unblock things and how we like prevent things from being blocked and how we propagate information, that becomes hugely important to me. And so it's going to look like I'm doing a bunch of people engineering and people problem solving, but I'm also having to enable a ton of it with technology because you have this quadratic level of communication required, and embedding the quadratic communication required into how work gets done means you have to really, really get good at that quadratics. You have to really get good at the n by n problem of I have this thing that I need to do, and I need to talk to 5 different stakeholders to do it. And they need to talk to 5 different people. And those 5 different people need to talk to, like, that's the n by m by n by m problem. You really have to learn how to solve that.
Let me clear my throat. Yeah, no, I'm left speechless here. I got a lot of value, a lot of insight from your wonderful mastermind, wizard, witch brain, the magic that is within your fingertips. Again, I'm glad that it's for the forces of good and not evil. It's been a pleasure having you, Hazel, and we're gonna have you again in some other form. Surely we will make it happen because I think we need to spread far and wide a human-based approach to making people within an organization have a better life and have more meaningful work, as well as making profitable and useful organizations. I mean, I think you're addressing the through this framework of how you think and how you act as a change agent, you're addressing how do you go into the fabric of society through organizations and make the whole organization as a unit perform better with people in mind, right? Not just, oh yeah, let's spend 20 million in infrastructure and not think about how to make people's lives better. The people that are working in the, equipment or whatever, they're more expensive and they're more potent than a machine. Um, So yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I'm just yeah, I'm delightfully surprised at all the wonderful things that you shared with us, and we'll do this again sometime.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.